October 2nd, 1983, Briarfield, New York. The ice cubes clinked against crystal glasses as laughter echoed through the Hendersons' living room. Outside, autumn leaves drifted past streetlights, settling on pristine driveways where Buicks and Oldsmobiles sat like monuments to suburban prosperity. Inside 47 Maple Drive, 8 dinner guests gathered around a mahogany table, their conversations flowing as smoothly as the wine. Richard Lawson adjusted his navy tie and glanced at his watch. 9:47 p.m. Across the table, his wife Helen smoothed her emerald dress and caught his eye. They'd been married 3 years, still young enough to feel like they were playing house in their rented colonial on Birch Street. Richard worked as a junior accountant at Peterson & Associates downtown, taking the 7:15 train each morning with other men in grey suits. Helen taught second grade at Briarfield Elementary, her gentle voice guiding children through their letters and numbers. "More coffee? Anyone?" Margaret Henderson asked, her voice cutting through the comfortable hum of after-dinner conversation. The dining room smelled of roast beef and cigarette smoke, the windows fogged from warmth and wine. "We should probably head home," Helen said softly, placing her napkin beside her plate. "And tomorrow's a school day," Richard nodded, pushing back his chair. "Thank you for a lovely evening, Margaret, Tom." He shook hands with their host, a stocky man who owned 3 hardware stores across Westchester County. The other guests, the Millers, the Cohens, and Eleanor Whitford, were settling into the living room with brandy snifters when the Lawsons gathered their coats. Eleanor, an elegant woman in her 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair, barely looked up from her conversation about the upcoming charity auction. "Drive safely," Margaret called from the doorway as Richard helped Helen into her wool coat. The roads might be slick. The blue 1979 Oldsmobile Cutlass started on the first turn of the key. Richard had always been proud of that car. Reliable, respectable, the kind of vehicle that announced you'd made it to the middle class without shouting about it. He backed out of the Hendersons' driveway at exactly 10:15 p.m., his headlights sweeping across the peaceful neighborhood. Helen reached over and touched his hand on the steering wheel. "That was nice," she said, "though Eleanor seemed distracted tonight." "Maybe she's tired," Richard replied, turning left onto Elm Street. Martin's been working late on that new development project. Neither of them noticed the dark sedan that pulled away from the curb behind them, following at a careful distance. The drive from Maple Drive to Birch Street should have taken exactly 7 minutes. Richard had timed it dozens of times during their 2 years in the neighborhood. Past the elementary, past the small shopping center with its pharmacy and bakery, past the turnoff to Croton River Park, where they sometimes walked on Sunday. But at 10:22 p.m., something went wrong. Margaret Henderson would later tell red dots. The next morning, when Helen didn't show up for work and Richard missed his train, their absence rippled through Briarfield like a stone dropped in still water. By noon, on October 3rd, their blue Oldsmobile had been found. October 3rd, 1983, Croton River Overlook, 6:47 a.m. Detective Frank Morrison crouched beside the abandoned Oldsmobile, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. The car sat perfectly centered in a parking space overlooking the Croton River, as if someone had carefully positioned it there. No skid marks on the asphalt, no broken glass or signs of struggle, just an empty car with its doors locked and keys missing. "Wallet's still in the glove compartment," Officer Patricia Chen called out, her voice echoing off the water below. "Credit cards, cash, even his business cards from Peterson & Associates." Morrison walked around the vehicle, his trained eyes cataloguing details. Helen's purse sat on the passenger seat, contents undisturbed. Her reading glasses were folded neatly in their case. Richard's briefcase lay on the back seat, exactly where he always placed it. "It's like they just vanished into thin air," Chen muttered, opening her notebook. Within hours, the parking area filled with searchers. Briarfield was the kind of community where neighbors still knew each other's names, where missing persons weren't statistics but familiar faces from the grocery store and PTA meetings. Margaret Henderson arrived with thermoses of coffee. Tom Henderson brought his hunting dogs. Even Eleanor Whitford appeared, her usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. "They were perfectly fine when they left our house," Margaret kept repeating to anyone who would listen. Laughing about something Helen said, Richard was talking about taking her to see that new movie next weekend. The river search began at sunrise on October 4th. Divers from the County Rescue Squad worked methodically through the dark water, their equipment creating ripples that caught the morning light. For 3 days, they found nothing but shopping carts and beer bottles. The debris of teenage parties and careless picnickers, Helen's second-grade classroom remained empty, her lesson plans still written on the blackboard in her careful handwriting. The children asked their substitute teacher when Mrs. Lawson was coming back, but no one had answers. Richard's boss at Peterson and Associates called Detective Morrison daily. "It's completely out of character," he insisted. Richard never missed work, never even called in sick. His desk is exactly as he left it Friday evening, calculator plugged in, pencils sharpened, everything in its place. By October 15th, the daily searches had dwindled to weekend volunteers. The story moved from the front page of the Briarfield Gazette to page 3, then to the police blotter. Halloween came and went, then Thanksgiving, then Christmas. The Lawsons' rental house stood empty through the winter, their landlord eventually packing their belongings into boxes that disappeared into a storage facility. At the 6-month mark, Detective Morrison filed his final report. "No evidence of foul play, sir," he wrote. "Possible accidental drowning, bodies carried downstream by current. Case remains open pending discovery of remains." But privately, Morrison had doubts. The positioning of the car bothered him. The missing keys, the fact that neither Richard nor Helen could swim well enough to survive if they'd somehow ended up in the river. In his desk drawer, he kept a folder marked "Lawson, Follow-up," filled with unanswered questions and half-formed theories. The community moved on, as communities do. New families moved into houses. New children filled classrooms. But sometimes, on quiet October evenings, long-time residents of Briarfield would drive past the river overlook and remember the couple who'd simply vanished, leaving behind only an empty car and the unsettling feeling that some secrets run deeper than moving water. Eleanor Whitford stopped hosting dinner parties. Margaret Henderson found herself checking her rearview mirror more often when driving alone at night. And Detective Morrison never quite shook the feeling that someone in Briarfield knew more than they were saying. March 18th, 2025, 152 Hillcrest Avenue, Briarfield. The sledgehammer struck concrete with a hollow thud that seemed to echo from somewhere much deeper than it should have. Construction foreman Mike Castillo paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool March air. For 3 weeks, his crew had been renovating the basement of the old Whitford estate, converting it into a modern wine cellar for the new owners. "That doesn't sound right," he muttered, kneeling beside the section of floor they'd been demolishing. The concrete here was different, newer, poured over what looked like an older foundation. His assistant, Tony Rodriguez, set down his jackhammer. "Sirs, what are you thinking, boss?" Castillo ran his hand along the edge where old concrete met new. The seam was barely visible, expertly smoothed, but the color was slightly different. This whole section was repoured, probably sometime in the 80s, judging by the concrete composition. "Maybe they had a leak or something," Tony suggested. But Castillo had 30 years in construction, and something felt wrong. The repoured section formed a perfect rectangle, roughly 8 feet by 4 feet. Too precise for a repair job, too deliberate. "Let's see what's underneath," he decided. By noon, they'd broken through the newer concrete and discovered a void below, a hidden storm shelter that didn't appear on any of the architectural plans. The metal ladder leading down was rusted but stable. Castillo descended first, his flashlight cutting through air that smelled of dampness and something else, something that made his stomach turn. The shelter was maybe 6 feet high and 10 feet square, built during the Cold War era when suburban families prepared for nuclear attack. But instead of canned goods and emergency supplies, Castillo's light illuminated 2 human skeletons lying side by side on a rotting mattress. They were bound together with rusted wire that had once been copper. Fragments of clothing clung to the bones, a woman's emerald dress, a man's navy tie. Beside them lay a woman's purse, its leather cracked but still intact, and a man's wallet, both perfectly preserved in the dry air. Castillo climbed up the ladder faster than he'd gone down, his hands shaking as he called 911. "This is Mike Castillo at 152 Hillcrest Avenue in Briarfield," he told the dispatcher. "You need to send police and the coroner. We've found what looks like 2 bodies. They've been here a long time." Detective Samuel Kearns arrived within 20 minutes. At 45, he was the same age Detective Morrison had been when the Lawsons first disappeared. Kearns had grown up in Briarfield, remembered the missing couple as a vague childhood memory, adult conversations that stopped when children entered the room. He descended into the hidden shelter with the county medical examiner, photographing everything before anything was moved. The purse contained a driver's license for Helen Catherine Lawson, expired October 1983. The wallet held Richard James Lawson's ID, business cards, and $47 in cash. "How long have they been here?" Kearns asked Dr. Sarah Martinez, the medical examiner. "Decades," she replied, carefully examining the remains. "The wire binding suggests they were restrained. I'll need to get them back to the lab for full analysis, but initial assessment indicates possible trauma to both skulls." Kearns photographed the shelter from every angle, noting details that would prove crucial later. The entrance had been sealed from above with fresh concrete, a professional job that would have required planning and equipment. Someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure these bodies stayed hidden. By evening, news trucks lined Hillcrest Avenue. The discovery of the Lawson remains sent shockwaves through Briarfield, dredging up memories that many residents had tried to forget. Margaret Henderson, now 78 and living in a retirement community in Florida, flew back to New York when reporters contacted her. "I always knew they didn't just disappear," she told Channel 7 News, tears streaming down her weathered face. "You don't leave your car by the river and just vanish. Someone did something terrible to Richard and Helen." The current owners of 152 Hillcrest Avenue, a young tech executive and his family who'd purchased the property 6 months earlier, were as shocked as anyone. They'd bought the house from Eleanor Whitford's estate after her death in 2024, drawn by its classic architecture and mature landscaping. Eleanor had been 93 when she died, her mind increasingly clouded by dementia in her final years. She'd lived alone in the house for decades after her husband Martin's death in 1997, gradually becoming a recluse who rarely left her property. But as Detective Kearns began pulling property records and old case files, a different picture of Eleanor Whitford began to emerge. The elegant socialite who'd attended dinner parties and charity auctions had harbored secrets beneath her perfectly maintained facade, and in her final months, according to her home health aide, Eleanor had begun talking about things that had happened a long time ago, conversations that made little sense at the time but now seemed to carry the weight of buried truth. April 12, 2025, Briarfield Police Department Detective Kearns spread the contents of Eleanor Whitford's safe across the conference table like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. Her attorney had turned over the sealed envelope marked, "To be opened only after my death," 3 weeks after the discovery of the bodies. Inside, Eleanor's careful handwriting filled 6 pages of cream-colored stationery, the same letterhead she'd used for charity correspondence and dinner party invitations. But these words carried a different weight entirely. "I can no longer carry this burden alone," the letter began. "What happened on October 2, 1983, has haunted me every day for 42 years. I should have spoken sooner, but I was a coward. I chose my comfortable life over justice for Richard and Helen Lawson." Kearns read the confession aloud to the assembled team, prosecutors, forensic specialists, and the FBI agents who'd joined the investigation. Eleanor's words painted a picture of a marriage built on secrets and a community where appearances mattered more than truth. Martin Whitford had been having an affair with Helen Lawson for 6 months before that October night. They'd met at the elementary school where Helen taught and where Martin served on the school board. What began as discussions about building improvements had evolved into stolen afternoons and carefully orchestrated encounters. Richard discovered the affair 3 days before the dinner party. Eleanor had written, "I found him in Martin's office that Friday evening, demanding that Martin stay away from his wife. The conversation was heated, but I thought it was over. I was wrong." According to Eleanor's account, Martin had followed the Lawsons when they left the Hendersons' house. He'd forced their car off the road near the river overlook, claiming he only wanted to talk, but Richard was beyond talking. "I heard the gunshot from the house," the letter continued. "One shot, echoing across the water. Martin came home 3 hours later, his clothes dirty, his hands shaking. He told me there had been an accident. He said Richard had attacked him and that Helen had tried to run. He said he'd had no choice." The medical examiner's report confirmed Eleanor's account. Both skeletons showed evidence of gunshot wounds to the head, and forensic analysis of the storm shelter revealed traces of 1980s concrete mixture, matching Martin Whitford's construction business records. Martin had sealed the bodies in the shelter the next day, telling neighbors he was waterproofing the basement against flooding. The concrete truck arrived early Sunday morning, and by afternoon, all evidence of the hidden chamber had been erased beneath a perfect layer of fresh concrete. But Eleanor's letter revealed another truth that shattered the community's understanding of the crime. Helen Lawson had still been alive when Martin brought them to the shelter. "I could hear her crying through the floor," Eleanor had written, her handwriting becoming increasingly erratic. She begged him to let her go, promised she wouldn't tell anyone what had happened. But Martin said it was too late, that Richard was already dead, and she'd seen too much. I listened to her voice for 3 days before it finally stopped. The revelation that Helen had been left to die slowly in the sealed shelter transformed the case from murder to something far more heinous. Eleanor's description of hearing Helen's voice through the basement floor became the detail that haunted everyone involved in the investigation. Dr. Martinez, the medical examiner, found evidence supporting Eleanor's account. Helen's skeletal remains showed signs of dehydration and starvation, consistent with surviving several days after the initial trauma. "I became complicit through my silence," Eleanor's letter concluded. "I chose to protect my husband and preserve our life together rather than save an innocent woman. I have lived with Helen's voice in my mind every day since. I hear her still, calling for help that I was too cowardly to provide." At the press conference announcing the solution to the 42-year-old cold case, Detective Kearns faced a room full of reporters and long-time Briarfield residents. Margaret Henderson sat in the front row, clutching tissues and nodding as each detail was revealed. "Eleanor Whitford died before we could bring charges," Kearns announced. "But her confession has finally given us the truth about what happened to Richard and Helen Lawson on October 2, 1983. The case resolution sent ripples through the community that extended far beyond the immediate crime. Property records showed that Martin Whitford had purchased several other properties in the 1980s, leading to questions about whether the Lawsons were his only victims. The FBI began excavating other sites associated with his construction business. Eleanor's house on Hillcrest Avenue was demolished 6 months later, the new owners unable to live with its history. But before the bulldozers arrived, ground-penetrating radar confirmed that the storm shelter had been the only hidden chamber on the property. Richard and Helen Lawson were buried together in Briarfield Cemetery on a grey November morning, their funeral attended by hundreds of people who had never stopped wondering what happened to the young couple who'd simply vanished. Their shared headstone bore a simple inscription, "Found at last together forever." Margaret Henderson, now 79, stood beside the grave as dirt was thrown over the caskets. "They were so young," she whispered, "so full of plans and dreams. They deserved so much better than what happened to them." The case officially closed on December 15, 2025, but questions lingered. Eleanor's health aide reported that in her final weeks, the elderly woman had talked about others who knew and secrets that died with Martin. Some residents wondered if the dinner party guests had suspected more than they'd admitted, if the community's collective silence had enabled the cover-up. Detective Kearns kept one photograph on his desk, Richard and Helen Lawson at their wedding in 1980, young and smiling, unaware that their love story would become Briarfield's darkest secret. Sometimes, working late in his office, he found himself studying their faces and wondering what other stories lay buried beneath the suburb's carefully maintained facades. In the end, justice for Richard and Helen Lawson came not through arrests or trials, but through the simple act of truth finally being spoken aloud. Their names were cleared of any suggestion that they had chosen to disappear, their families finally able to grieve properly, and their community forced to confront the price of staying silent when evil hides behind respectability. But on quiet autumn evenings in Briarfield, when the leaves drift past streetlights and the air carries the scent of approaching winter, some residents still find themselves driving past the empty lot where the Whitford house once stood, remembering the couple who'd been hidden beneath its foundation and wondering what other secrets time might eventually reveal.